Okay, today's precon in the Chop Shop is Growing Threat, a Phyrexian Tribal deck with an artifact creature sub-theme and a splash of proliferate in white-black. The face commander for this precon is Brimaz, Blight of Oreskos, a 3/4 legendary Phyrexian cat for 2 white-black that says, whenever you cast a Phyrexian creature or artifact creature spell, Incubate X, where X is that spell's mana value. Incubate is one set mechanic for March of the Machine that says, create an incubator token with X 1/1 counters on it, and pay 2 to transform this artifact. It transforms into a 0/0 Phyrexian artifact creature. Then it says at the beginning of each end step, if a Phyrexian died under your control this turn, proliferate. As a Phyrexian tribal leader that deals with Incubate, Brimaz doesn't really do as well as Glissa in my opinion. I really don't think that Brimaz will be very expensive to purchase as a single if you want to build Phyrexian Artifact Creature Tribal without buying this precon. The secondary commander Moira and Teshar is a 4/5 legendary Phyrexian Spirit Bird with flying that costs 3 white-black. It says whenever you cast a historic spell, return target non-land permanent card from your graveyard to the battlefield. It gains haste, exile it at the beginning of the next end step. If it would leave the battlefield, exile it instead of putting it anywhere else. Historic spells, as a reminder, are artifacts, legendaries, and sagas. So again, this commander will feel most at home in an artifact-themed deck. Unfortunately, the cards you get back will only be back for a single turn and is exiled when it leaves the battlefield, so no death triggers for you. When it comes to this particular strategy, I'm not that well versed in it. Building a deck with a lot of ETB effects and effective artifact spells that will let you get those ETBs twice in a match sounds good, but I prefer more long-lasting value instead. Because Moira and Teshar need a specific strategy and cards to make the deck work, I don't see this card going over $1. If you like it, get it as a single. Next are the new cards introduced in the precon. Filigree Vector is a 1/1 that costs 3 into white. It says when it ETBs, put a 1/1 counter on each of any number of target creatures and charge counters on each of any number of target artifacts. Then you can pay 1, tap, and sacrifice another artifact to proliferate. The addition to adding charge counters to this creature's ETB is very interesting, and it widens the effectiveness in other decks that use those counters. Adding 1/1 counters is pretty standard, but since this creature will also proliferate those counters, it's better than it would have been otherwise. I don't think this card will be very expensive as a single, even though it can find a home in many counter-based decks in white. This is similar to Throne of Geth, and that card is under $1. Vulpine Harvester is a 3/3 Phyrexian Fox for 3 into white that says, whenever one or more Phyrexians you control attack, return target artifact card from your graveyard to the battlefield if its mana value is less than or equal to their total power. I think this card was specifically designed for this deck, honestly, and because of that, its usability in other decks becomes very limited. However, if you convert Brimaz into an artifact creature deck, those token Phyrexians will be able to bring artifact creatures back to the field, which can be a very powerful effect compared to Moira and Teshar. If you buy Brimaz as a single, this fox should be in the shopping cart with it. Blight Titan is a 6/6 Phyrexian giant with Death Touch for 4 and 2 black. It says whenever it ETBs or attacks, mill 2 cards, then incubate X, where X is the number of creature cards in your graveyard. This guy will probably be most at home in a self-mill deck. The interesting thing about those incubate tokens though is that like vehicles, they'll survive creature board wipes, and you can pay 2 for each one to make a creature if you need it before or during your next turn. Again, this guy won't be very expensive as a single, but will be a great inclusion in a deck like Bladewing, where you want your graveyard full of creatures and don't necessarily need to reanimate them. Excise the Imperfect is an instant for 1 and 2 white that says exile target non-land permanent. Its controller incubates X, where X is its mana value. I don't think this will be an expensive single, but because it exiles any permanent, it still might be pretty effective. Even if you exile a dangerous artifact or planeswalker, dealing with a big Phyrexian with no abilities still might be a better option. I'm not sure about this one, honestly, and I'm probably not the only one. So this card will probably be left in the precon or put into a deck that wants a lot of exile effects. Bitterthorn Nissa's Animus is a 3-cost legendary equipment with an equip cost of 3 and Living Weapon. Living Weapon says when it ETBs, create a 0/0 Black Phyrexian Germ and attach this to it. Equipped creature gets +1/+1 and says, whenever equipped creature attacks, you may search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. This might be the most expensive single in this precon, since it's basically a budget Sword of the Animist, which is a $10 card after 6 printings, and it can be useful in any deck. The last new card is Darksteel Splicer, a 1/1 Phyrexian Artificer for 6 and a white that says, whenever it or another non-token Phyrexian enters the battlefield under your control, create X 3/3 colorless Phyrexian Golem artifact creature tokens, where X is the number of opponents you have. Then it says, golems you control have indestructible. When it ETBs, if you have 3 opponents, you're making 3 golems for a total of 10 power on the field. Then if you cast a cheap Phyrexian creature, you get 3 more. If this stays on the field, things might get out of hand very quickly. But because it requires Phyrexians to trigger the ability, this won't find a home in a lot of decks unless they're already leaning into golem tokens. This is because some of the reprints that are in this deck as well. Blade Splicer makes a golem and gives golems first strike. Master Splicer makes a golem and gives them +1/+1. But both of those splicers have been errated to count as Phyrexian creatures also. So any golem deck that utilizes these splicers will absolutely want Darksteel Splicer in the deck as well. Other notable reprints in the deck are Phyrexian Delver, which will get a creature card back from your graveyard to the battlefield, and then you lose life equal to its mana value. Massacre Worm will clear the board of weenie creatures and make your opponents lose life when their creatures die. So I was very surprised to find out that this card was only around $5. Ancient Stone Idol can be a free cast in a go-wide token deck, or a cheap combat trick if an opponent sends out a lot of attackers on their turn. Phyrexian Scriptures is a delayed board wipe for non-artifact creatures, and Graveyard Hate for 4 mana. It's not bad if it fits the theme of your deck. Then Karn's Bastion, that's a last resort in proliferate decks, and Fetid Heath for our lands. The interesting thing about the Growing Threat Precon is that it does a very good job at churning out those Incubate tokens, and those tokens can become a sizable army at instant speed. But it's like holding back mana for removal to transform those creatures. You're only going to do so once or twice per turn after casting a spell the previous turn, so you might not get as much value for the mana otherwise. The Planechase cards in the deck are Path of the Schemer, a sorcery that costs 4 and a black that says each player mills 2 cards. Then you put a creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. It's an artifact in addition to its other types. And then it says, starting with you, each player votes for Planeswalk or Chaos. If Planeswalk gets more votes, Planeswalk. If Chaos gets more votes, or the vote is tied, Chaos ensues. Then there's Ichor Elixir, a 4-cost artifact that says if you would roll 1 or more planar dice, instead roll that many +1 and ignore 1. It can also tap for 2 colorless mana. The Plains cards in the deck are Esper, Ketria, Naktamun, Nyx, Panopticon, Spatial Merging, the Aetherflues, the Great Forest, the Pit, and Undercity Reaches. Unfortunately, in my opinion, this precon doesn't have the same level of oomph that we've seen in the previous precons. Upgrading it is going to require cards that buff those incubated tokens or your Phyrexians, but once you start adding cards to accomplish that goal, you're going to find yourself drifting away from Phyrexian Tribal and into artifact creatures, and not only that, you're going to be setting aside more than half of your precon. So why would you buy the precon in that case? It'll be better, in my opinion, to buy Brimaz as a single and build the deck from scratch. However, if you want to build Phyrexian Tribal, you might be better off replacing the white with green and running Glissa, Herald of Predation, as your commander instead. You won't have to pay to transform your Incubate tokens, she makes them for free, and she'll give all of your Phyrexians Death Touch and First Strike, giving your opponents a very difficult Declare Blockers step. The only single that will find a high price out of this precon will be Bitterthorn. But even if you pick that up with a few of the other singles in the deck for whatever reason, you won't come close to the full price of the precon. So unfortunately for me, it looks like Growing Threat was more like a dwindling value instead. It's a shame because I was really looking forward to it. And pick up singles if you want to avoid this precon, since breaking it apart won't really improve any other decks you may have already either. For me, I'll probably just pick up Bitterthorn if it winds up being pretty cheap compared to Sword of the Animist. Massacre Worm and Filigree Vector are on that list too, but I probably won't pick them up unless I know I can slot them in a deck as soon as I get them. Next time we'll talk about Divine Convocation, so look forward to that. Like the video if you liked the video, dislike it if you disliked it, and until next time, I'm Space Coconut, and you're welcome.